Hi everyone, my name is Brian DeSono. I'm a PhD candidate at Syracuse University. This is going to be a dry run of my dissertation presentation that I will be delivering in 2 hours. My work that I'll be presenting later today is going to be years of culminating research, and the title of this dissertation is Identity Work of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders on Reddit, Traversals of Deliberation, Moderation, and Decolonization. So, to start off, I would like to acknowledge with respect the Onondaga Nation, firekeepers of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the indigenous peoples on whose ancestral land Syracuse University now stands. I think this is really important to bring up because I will be talking about decolonization much later on in this talk. I'm largely interested in studying social computing, which is concerned with the intersection of social behavior and computational systems. I primarily publish in venues like CHI, which is the premier conference for human-computer interaction research, as well as ACM's Computer-Supported Cooperative Work Conference. So throughout this presentation, I'll be referring to marginalization quite often, and it's this process of excluding a particular group of people to the periphery of society by denying them of their voice, identity, or place in it. I'll be delving into how identities can become marginalized. So across different disciplines, identity is operationalized in different ways. In sociology, we have the perspective from Goffman. He says that identity is constructed in relation to rules and norms in a social setting. And gender theorist Judith Butler looks at identity as a multifaceted, fluid construct in that people could have several identities at once. And then from psychology, I've also drawn from Tajfel, who looks at identity as a way for individuals to define their own standing in society. While what you see on the slide has different conceptualizations of identity, they're all centered around individual identity. And my dissertation research is very interested in collective identity. So I will actually be drawing much heavily upon David Snow's conceptualization of identity work, which is a process through which people can make sense of or reconstruct their identities. And the empirical studies in my field that I mentioned earlier, the conferences like CHI and CCW, there's ongoing empirical work at looking in the ways in which information communication technologies help augment identity work in different ways. For example, disadvantaged college students have been using these socio-technical platforms to find mentorship opportunities to help them further their advancement in college. And we've also seen how platforms can inhibit ways that different communities or different groups of people can express themselves online. For example, the transgender community has previously had obstacles trying to express their identity with Facebook's past binary demarcations of gender. There's also work that's been going on by Saman et al. On veteran reintegration, looking at the transitions from liminal phases of the military to civilian transition for veterans. And I'm particularly interested in looking at the emergent properties of collective identity work and the work involved in reframing these collective identities. And the population I'm very interested in studying as a proxy for this lens are Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. While much of scholarship in CHI and CCW already has perspectives that show how those in mainland China use technology, those Asian Americans who are born in the United States have a different lived experience. So I'll be referring to Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in this presentation as AAPIs, and they are a pan-ethnic identification. This term did not actually come to be until the Civil Rights Movement, and this is when, historically, the Chinese in America, the Japanese in America, the Koreans in America, they didn't really, they had previous historical tensions, but they actually united together during the Civil Rights Movement for a number of reasons that are outside the scope of this presentation, but they were able to find political momentum in gathering under this political umbrella. Today, there are over 20 million AAPIs living in the United States as of 2018, according to Pew Research, and AAPIs are the fastest growing immigrant group in the United States. The dissertation is motivated along the central research question of how do people use online platforms to engage in collective identity work? And I employed an inductive qualitative research approach to understanding how Reddit discourse occurs in identity workspaces. So why Reddit? Well, any user or Redditor can create a community or a subreddit on nearly any topic. And I think this is what makes it really rich for identity work discourse. There's content that can take the form of text, images, animated GIFs, links, and the platform itself also lends a developer-friendly API to scientists and researchers. So in examining how marginalized communities are studied, reflexively understanding authors' race and ethnicity may bring certain affinities into perspective. I personally identify as Filipino American, and I've previously engaged in advocacy work for the AAPI community. I've been subscribed to subreddits for more than 4 years, but this is more of an observer or a lurker capacity. So while I'm familiar with what goes on in these subreddits, I don't really go out of my way to influence the identity work discourse that happens there. The dissertation itself is partitioned into three studies, and for the sake of time, I will be focusing more on studies 2 and 3 today. The first study was really significant in helping me inform the design of the subsequent 2 studies. The first study looks at identity work as deliberation, particularly in the context of the 2016 US presidential election. So Habermas describes the public sphere as a domain of our social life through which public opinion is formed. And I draw on Habermas to think of these public spheres and the ways in which people interact in the engagement of deliberation in and around their identities. So Habermas says that public sphere must have certain values for it to function properly. Inclusion means that everyone should be able to participate. Civility means that people should be respectful when they are deliberating. And rationality means that people should be able to provide evidence for their argumentation. There's a gap in literature that has yet to explain the relationship between identity work and high context cultures, which are defined with the characteristics that you see here. Examples of high context societies include South Asian culture or East Asian culture, which often have patriarchal decision-making and family dynamics. Again, in collectivist cultures, the priorities of the collective supersede that of the priorities of the individual. So when we look at Eastern or low context societies like the United States, you see it's more centered around individualistic concerns and individual priorities. So for the first study, I was really interested in looking at how APIs are constructing and expressing their identity in online communities and what factors affect participation in online identity work. Here, I was able to scrape data in the form of storing comments as JSON files into a non-relational database. These comments came from r/Asian American, which is a pan-Asian American subreddit. And within this study, I was looking at the subset of comments that happened a month prior to and a month after the November 2nd election results. And within this subset of data, there were 4,406 comments analyzed amongst 888 distinct Redditors. I trained a team of 2 undergraduate coders to iteratively and redundantly code samples of 500 comments, each time computing Cohen's kappa for each variable and discussing disagreements. The coders weighted whether or not the comment satisfied each of the Habermasian values I discussed earlier. And after 3 rounds of redundant coding, we achieved an acceptable average pairwise Cohen's kappa score amongst all coders involved for the Habermasian values. We then split this corpus into 3 sets and then coded the 4,406 comments independently in relation to their comment thread title. Here's a quick code book of the different codes and just examples of what identity work on r/Asian American subreddit looks like. And for the sake of time, I'm only going to be going over very high-level findings of this study. Here we see online communities like Reddit invite the ad hoc formation of a public sphere. Most notably, I've been able to observe the ways in which moderators impact the types of comments that are allowed and even the types of people that can be invited into the conversation. So for example, if content is inflammatory or if it has racist or misogynistic remarks, moderators are there to ban those comments or ban those users. And we also see that Redditors are providing a number of resources like links to help people make sense of the election during this time. Overall, this study contributes this concept of identity work as deliberation, which links identity work as a discursive political activity where all actors involved acquire the means to interpret their understanding of what it means to be AAPI in their own terms. When deliberation fell out of line with values of the public sphere, moderators return and reconnect the deliberation into the bigger picture of AAPI solidarity. All right. So this study looks at the moderation practices as emotional labor in sustaining online communities. So in returning to Habermas, his concept of the public sphere has been subject to considerable criticism by feminist scholars. Habermas was also criticized because his ideal of the public sphere was based on rationality rather than emotionality. In our modern network society, digital publics are mobilized and connected or disconnected through affective statements that blend fact with opinion and emotion, which demonstrates the importance of affect in creating feelings of community to sustain involvement and connections. For those who are unaware, moderators are volunteer stewards who help shape and enforce the rules and norms of their community. And moderating a subreddit is an unofficial voluntary position. Moderators do have the ability to change their subreddit's overall look and feel, edit their rules page, and view the backend analytics of their subreddit, as well as manage items that are flagged for review. I think what was really helpful for me in this study was looking at like the public moderators that are listed on the sidebar. And this is an example of the sidebar that you see on the screen. The sidebars of all subreddits usually have a description of what the subreddit's about. The moderators are listed publicly, and it also shows you the subscriber count. So within this study, I was really interested in looking at how moderators shape the identity work of online communities, and how does emotional labor sustain an online community in AAPI context. Again, the second and third study was kind of developed inductively based on the insights of the first study. So for the methods for the second study, I was able to directly solicit and message the moderators of 118 that were listed within the different API subreddits I've been able to study. And I employed maximum variation sampling to understand the phenomena amongst different groups of people in a variety of contexts. So I was able to conduct semi-structured interviews with 21 moderators from 13 different API subreddits. And I was able to, after obtaining consent from each participant, iteratively code and employ memoing techniques from the transcripts and then thematically analyze those transcripts using NVivo qualitative analysis software. So here is an example of the different subreddits I've been able to study. Here you can see that a number of the subreddits on their name alone have been looking at intersectional facets of identity. So for example, we see r/ABC Desis or American Born Confused Desis. And Desi is a South Asian term that those of South Asian descent use to refer to each other. You also have subreddits like r/Asian2X, which refer to the double X chromosome for those who identify as female. And you also see on the right column that the moderator count has certain asterisks in different subreddits. These asterisks represent that at least one moderator is a bot. And I'll be talking about this a bit later, but moderators are also using bots to help them moderate at scale. Here we also see a summary of participant demographics, and I've been able to interview 21 moderators, 12 of which identified as cis male and 9 identified as cis female. The majority of moderators were aged in their 20s. All but one moderator identified with having Asian or mixed Asian heritage. Moderators were also highly educated, as 19 had at least a bachelor's degree and 8 had the equivalent of a master's or doctoral degree. It's also really interesting to note that these moderators spend anywhere from 3 hours a week moderating to upwards to 6 or even 8 hours a week moderating their subreddits. So for the sake of time, I'm only going to be going over a couple of the themes that I've been able to report in this study. So out of the 6 themes, 3 of which were relevant to the challenges that were there for sustaining moderation as a practice, and then the remaining 3 themes looked at the strategies that moderators employed. One of the most telling findings I've been able to see in this study was the ways in which AAPI moderators burn out from volunteer work. And I'll have, in the next slide, a quote from a participant who can describe this further.
It's been a tiring job doing this for free and dealing with a lot of the shit that we've dealt with. And so now I kind of just mostly focus on like DC2X and my private sub and just keeping the community going and keeping that space open for other girls, who maybe like me.
So here we see P16. She's a moderator of r/DC2X. It stands for, or represents a subreddit for South Asian females. And I think it's really interesting how a number of our female moderators have been able to disclose to me how a number of them were subject to harassment. A number of them were threatened with their personal information being posted online. They're constantly juggling their own personal safety to keep their subreddits alive. And one of the moderation strategies I'd like to share is how these moderators integrate an ecology of tools for self-organized moderation.
I wish Reddit itself would have those kinds of tools integrated to the platform, but they don't. The toolbar, automod, all that stuff, like it's not actually Reddit created those kinds of things. It's users created it and made it better.
So here we see how moderators are also taking it upon themselves to script the bots that they're creating to help them with their moderation. They're the ones creating these Chrome extensions to help improve their moderation duties. And again, these are technologies that Reddit as a platform are not providing to its moderators. So they're really taking it upon themselves to build these tools. The study also contributes a discussion on the cost of emotional labor, as well as provides implications for developing and designing these platforms for sustainable volunteerism, suggesting that we can do a better job empowering moderators through visible social support, since the bulk of the work that they do is already invisible and not much of the community knows about it. So the third study looks at the decolonizing tactics as collective resilience. And for those who are unaware, in socio-historical context, colonization is this process by which a central system of power dominates a surrounding land and its components. It involved the enslavement, rape, genocide, and erasure of indigenous peoples within Asian nations by Western imperialist powers. So, for example, France colonized Cambodia, Spain colonized the Philippines, Great Britain colonized India. And over time, these end up in pernicious effects. For example, the colonized are conditioned to believe that they're different and therefore inferior. I fully understand that my body is a byproduct of colonization. My parents didn't really teach me Tagalog or Ilocano, which are the dialects in the Philippines that they've learned. And they didn't teach me this growing up because they wanted to make sure I was able to speak in America without an accent growing up. So unfortunately, I won't be able to now, teach these languages to my future children. And it's this erasure of culture over time that really speaks to how dangerous colonization is. And scholarship on race on the internet remains largely Eurocentric in orientation. There's ongoing work on post-colonial computing that has been really showing issues of culture and power in the design methods in conferences like UBIComp and DIS, which are tangential to kind CCW. A number of critical scholars think that post-colonial computing is blind to issues of race and gender. And this is why decolonization as a lens really centers non-Western perspectives that are located at the margins of the racial world system. So for the third study, I was really interested in learning how socio-technical systems contour and contribute to the marginalization of fringe communities, and how APIs are using technology to decolonize their collective identity. So here, I've been able to have 3 main findings. Been able to see that APIs are reclaiming space to confront their communities being invaded. They're also recording collective memory to circumvent systemic erasure, and they're revising cultural narratives to deconstruct colonial mentality, For the sake of time, I'm just going to be going over one of the threats, which is the disruption of identity network discourse that 7 of our moderators have disclosed to me, and one of the tactics, which is discourse preservation in alternate archives, which 6 of the participants have shared with me. So I'll have this moderator describe it.
During the election period, there was a lot of non-Asian that came about these masculinity posing as Asian. These were troll accounts. They were outright funded troll accounts, and they were trying to push the American male narrative more towards alt-right Asian. They were trying to push a little bit more red pill philosophy, more of a conservative viewpoint.
So P7 moderates for r/Asian Bros, which is a subreddit for Asian male masculinity discourse. And here, a number of moderators as well have been describing how, especially during times of an election, their subreddits were often hijacked by outsiders to influence the ways in which others perceive this subreddit and its communities during really chaotic times.
I really want to transfer all this so that we have a backup option. So the day they delete our form, they delete our community, we can immediately boot up through some other place. Either on some Chinese internet here, we just have it over there or something like that.
So these are the words from P9, who moderates for r/Asian Identity, which is a Pan-Asian activist-oriented subreddit. Here he's sharing with me the foresight that he will be doing to back up.
I just don't know research.
Oh yeah, feel free to wait outside and research.
Okay.
And here he's really sharing how they're using these spaces. Here he's really sharing with me how he's foreshadowing that platforms like Reddit might not be around in 10 or 20 or 50 years. So having the identity work discourse here saved elsewhere will be really important to preserve what they've been discussing online. So in response to dismantling colonial structures that persist online, API Redditors are actively developing collective resistance and resisting algorithmic hegemony. To summarize, this dissertation work provides implications for the design of online communities used within high context cultures and addresses the cultural concerns working within and around these communities and their unique values. It also informs how emotional labor impacts the moderation of platforms that afford pseudo-anonymous interactions for identity work and illustrate how socio-technical systems are used amongst marginalized communities to decolonize themselves from systemic hegemony. This dissertation, in terms of limitations, the sample of participants who moderate for API subreddits do not represent the experiences of other Redditors who engage in identity work in different ways. And similar to the nature of interview studies and qualitative research, the goal is not to produce generalizability, but rather to study a specific phenomena in a focused context. Future work will look into how generational considerations complicate the transmission of identity online. And to make identity work visible is to make identity work matter. Marginalization of groups have been occurring for millennia, but online communities provide a space for people to safely negotiate their tensions of their intersectional identities. And here I'd like to acknowledge my advisor, the student collaborators, the doctoral peers, and my dissertation committee. Thanks.